I am a single mother, raising my 8-year-old son, Mark, who was only 5 years old when this happened. We live in a small house that was passed down to me from my grandparents. It's nestled in the quiet side of town, surrounded by older folks who've been here for years. It's a peaceful place, one where you can leave your door unlocked and not worry about the dangers of the outside world. Mark and I still live here today, but what happened that Christmas is something that has stayed with me and changed the way I see the world. It was a typical holiday season. I was doing my Christmas shopping, running errands to buy presents for my family, and Mark was tagging along, excited about the holiday festivities. We'd gone to the mall to finish up the shopping. We hit a few clothing stores, a hardware store where I bought a gift for my dad, and then finally, I treated Mark to some McDonald's for lunch. It had been a long day of shopping, and I wanted to give Mark a little treat before heading home. After the meal, we left the mall through the south exit, which wasn't as busy as the main one. As we were walking, we bumped into a mall Santa standing just outside. He waved enthusiastically and greeted us with his usual cheery lines. "Ho, ho, ho! Merry Christmas," he called out. I smiled, feeling the holiday cheer, and Mark tugged on my hand, eager to talk to him. The Santa knelt down to Mark's level, his costume a bit more worn than I expected, but I figured it was just the usual mall Santa uniform. He asked Mark what he wanted for Christmas, and Mark eagerly responded with a Nintendo Switch. I couldn't help but smile, as I had already planned on buying it for him. The Santa laughed heartily and said, "Well, if you've been good, maybe you'll get it, young man," while winking at me. It was a playful interaction, nothing strange about it at first. As he stood up, he turned to me and started complimenting me in a way that made me feel a little uncomfortable, though I brushed it off. "Your mother's a looker, Mark," he said, chuckling. "You know that, right?" Mark laughed, not understanding what that meant, but I forced a smile. We exchanged a few more pleasantries about the holiday chaos and the crowds at the mall. The Santa mentioned that he worked there, which seemed plausible. I told him how stressful it was being a single mom during Christmas, and he responded with, "It's a lot, I bet. You deserve some help, don't you?" I chuckled awkwardly, feeling the pressure of my responsibilities weighing on me. Then, he made an offhand comment that would haunt me for weeks. "Mark, have you ever heard the song, 'I Saw Mommy Kissing Santa Claus'?" Mark nodded his head enthusiastically, and before I knew it, the Santa leaned in closer. "Well then, give your mom a kiss like in the song," he said, motioning to me. I didn't think much of it at first. I leaned in to give Mark a little peck on the cheek, but as I did, Mark turned his head, and the Santa, with a predatory move, tried to plant a kiss on my lips instead. I jerked my head back just in time, and I felt my stomach drop. The smile I had forced on my face faded, and I could feel the weight of unease settling in. The Santa's behavior was too forward, too aggressive for someone playing the role of jolly old Saint Nick. I quickly grabbed Mark's hand and said, "Come on, let's go." As we walked away, the Santa called after us, "Merry Christmas," his voice unnervingly cheerful. It was the last time I heard him speak. Once we were safely in the car and driving home, I looked back in my rearview mirror, only to notice something strange. The Santa was no longer standing in front of the mall's south exit. I tried to shake off the feeling of discomfort, but something about that moment didn't sit right with me. I had a bad feeling, but I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. We got home, unloaded the car, and I locked the door behind us. Mark and I settled down to watch a Christmas movie, trying to forget about the unsettling encounter. But as I was about to relax, my doorbell rang. I froze. It was late, too late for any sort of door-to-door salespeople or deliveries. I glanced at Mark, who was absorbed in the movie, and told him to keep watching. I moved cautiously toward the door, already feeling a wave of dread wash over me. I asked through the door. "Who is it?" The voice on the other side was calm but unfamiliar. "It's Santa." My heart dropped into my stomach. I felt a chill run through my body. I immediately thought of the mall Santa, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I replied, "If you're the mall Santa, please go away or I'll call the police." The man's voice softened, but there was an edge to it. "You dropped something out of your bag, miss. I'm just here to return it." "Return it?" I replied, my voice shaky. "What did I drop?" "I don't know, miss. I'm not trying to be nosy. If you open the door, I can hand it to you," he said, his tone oddly persistent. I knew something was wrong. I didn't open the door, but instead decided to call the mall's management office. When I mentioned the Santa, the person on the phone sounded confused. "We don't officially hire mall Santas," they told me. "Whoever's dressing up is doing it on their own." My mind raced. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, realizing that the man outside had no connection to the mall at all. I had been followed, and I didn't know by whom or for what reason. I quickly called the police, and while I was on the phone with them, I told Mark to keep watching the movie. I stepped away to the kitchen, trying to calm my nerves. But when I raised the blinds to peek outside, I saw nothing. The yard was dark. The only sound was the distant wind. But then, a deep voice bellowed from the darkness. "Ho, ho, ho!" I froze. He was out there, lurking in the shadows. My heart hammered in my chest, and I immediately dialed 911. The police arrived soon after, and while I was relieved they were there, the uneasy feeling in my stomach didn't go away. They took a report and assured me they would handle it, but the stranger didn't leave me alone that night. A few nights later, the doorbell rang again, this time a little later than before. Mark was already asleep, and I was sitting in the living room, trying to unwind. I turned off the TV and headed upstairs to my room, which was connected to Mark's. I stayed upstairs for the rest of the night, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, as I went to leave the house, I found a note taped to the front door. It was printed out, the font clean and neat, but the words were chilling. "I'll just be blunt. I'm sure you can guess who this is. I didn't mean to scare you the other night. I just had a long shift. And when a pretty lady talks to you after pretending to be Santa for 6 hours, hormones kind of go crazy. You and your son are the cutest things ever, and I'd love to one day be a part of your family. You can't pretend you didn't feel the connection when we spoke the other night. I already know where you live now. I just need your number. Feel free to shoot me a text whenever, and maybe we can plan something one day. Sorry if this seems creepy, but I'm the kind of guy who goes after what I want. Happy holidays. If we don't speak soon, here's my number. Best, Ted." I felt sick to my stomach. I immediately called the police again and showed them the note. The fact that he had included his phone number made me feel even more threatened. The police said they would investigate, and by the following Monday, I got a call from a detective who assured me the man would not contact me again. If he did, I was to report it immediately. Since then, I've never heard from that creepy Santa again. I can only assume the police scared him off with the threat of arrest, but the fear didn't leave me. I've learned to be cautious, to trust my instincts, and never ignore that gut feeling of unease. Christmas should be a time of joy and celebration, but for me, it's forever tinged with the fear of a stranger who dared to invade my family's holiday. I'll never forget that Santa, the man who wasn't jolly, the man who took more than just the joy of the season. He took my peace of mind. I don't remember much from when I was 6, but there's one memory that still lingers in my mind, as vivid as if it happened only a few years ago. It was December 2020. My fiance and I had just bought a house together, an adorable little place in a quiet, friendly neighborhood. It seemed like the perfect spot to raise a family. That's why what happened 2 years ago was all the more shocking and, frankly, horrifying. We knew all our neighbors by name, the ones next door and the 3 houses across the street. Everyone was friendly. But of course, you never really know what's hidden behind someone's closed door. Paul, the guy who lived to the right of us, was one of those quiet types. We'd exchange pleasantries when we saw each other, but that was about it. I'd notice him coming and going every day, presumably to work, though I never really knew what he did for a living. But then, a few days went by, and I realized I hadn't seen him at all. His car hadn't moved from the driveway either. It wasn't anything alarming at first after all. People go out of town, or sometimes just stay home. But then I started to notice little things. Paul's house had already been decorated for Christmas, which seemed odd for a single man in his 40s, but it was nice. One night, as I was getting around to putting up our own lights, I noticed something strange about his decorations. All of Paul's Christmas lights started flickering. Not just 1 or 2 strands, but the entire display, blinking like a faulty wiring job. At first, I thought it was just an electrical glitch, nothing more. The next day, I left for work around 10 o'clock, and as I walked past Paul's house, I saw the same thing. His car was still in the driveway. The blinds in his house were shut tight, and when I got back home that evening, nothing had changed. The lights were on, but the house remained eerily still. I joked with my fans, saying Paul must have been hibernating or something. Later that night, my fans came inside and mentioned the lights were flickering again. Curious, I went outside to take a look, and sure enough, the lights were flashing in a glitchy, random pattern, as if someone was trying to get attention. I figured I'd be a good neighbor and go check on him. Maybe he needed help. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I rang the doorbell, and still nothing. The lights were on inside, but the blinds were still shut. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. Paul greeted me, looking a little off. I mentioned the lights, which, by now, had stopped flickering. He seemed surprised, but thanked me for letting him know. I asked if he was okay, since I hadn't seen him around much. He claimed he was just feeling under the weather. His voice sounded strange, almost like he was trying to cover something up. Then, as we were talking, I heard something scream. It was faint, but it was unmistakable. A child's scream, full of fear and desperation. Paul didn't have any kids. I froze. I almost asked him if he heard it, but I didn't. Something told me to leave. I said goodbye and went back to the house, but the scream still echoed in my mind. I told my fiancé immediately. I said, "I think Paul has a kid in there. I think he kidnapped her." Her face was a mix of disbelief and confusion. "What are you talking about?" she asked. I repeated myself, and she immediately dialed the police. I called anonymously, explaining I thought I'd heard a child screaming inside Paul's house, a man who didn't have any children and hadn't been leaving his home for days. The police arrived quickly, and when they entered Paul's house, I could barely breathe. What they found was worse than I could have ever imagined. There was a young boy locked in Paul's basement. He'd been there for 4 days, possibly longer. He'd been kidnapped from a town miles away. And as for the flickering lights, the boy, a smart and resourceful child, had somehow figured out how to manipulate the Christmas lights from the basement to signal for help. He must have seen me when I was at Paul's door and used his only means of escape to reach out. I'm glad the boy was rescued. I don't want to think about what Paul had done to him, but I hope the kid can move past it and live a normal life. Paul? He won't be getting out of prison anytime soon. A few weeks later, I found myself alone at home for the weekend. My girlfriend, Jenny, came over to spend time with me. It was mid-December, and Christmas had taken over our home. We ordered some food, popped open a bottle of wine, and settled in front of the TV to watch some holiday classics. We started with the Polar Express, then switched to elf. At some point, we ran out of wine, so I decided to make a quick trip to the liquor store down the street. It was a Saturday, and the store stayed open late. The usual cashier was there, and we started chatting like we always do. In the middle of our conversation, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I looked at the screen. Jenny. "Hold on," I said to the cashier, and answered. Jenny's voice was shaky. "I keep hearing noises from downstairs, from the crawl space." I reassured her it was nothing, that maybe it was just the house settling, but she sounded genuinely scared. "Can you stay on the phone with me until you get back?" "Of course," I said, hanging up with the cashier and walking home. It was only a 5-minute walk, but it felt longer with Jenny's fear on my mind. When I got back, Jenny was still on the couch, her eyes wide with unease. I asked if she'd heard anything else, but she said no, though she wondered aloud if an animal might be down there. I dismissed the idea. "There's no way," I said. "There are no openings from the outside." I popped the cork on the wine, and we tried to relax. But then, we both heard it, a distinct thud coming from below us. We froze, exchanging a look of concern. Maybe it was an animal. I grabbed a flashlight from the closet and headed to the crawl space. The door creaked as I opened it. The musty smell hit me immediately. Urine. I scanned the area quickly, but there was nothing to see, just boxes and dust. Still, the smell was undeniable. I told my parents about it later, suggesting they call pest control. But as I climbed back up the stairs, something moved from across the crawl space. I couldn't see what it was, but the movement was unmistakable. My heart raced. I quickly slammed the door shut and locked it. The rest of the night was uneventful, and we eventually went to bed. But at 3 a.m., I woke up needing to use the bathroom. When I opened my bedroom door, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the end of the hallway, a figure stood in the dark, a silhouette. I gasped, trying to suppress a scream. Slowly, I closed the door and locked it. But then the footsteps started. Someone was walking toward me. The doorknob jiggled as someone tried to open it. A deep, guttural voice whispered, "Hello." Jenny shot up in bed, screaming. I was frozen, heart pounding. I couldn't even respond, my fear choking me. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded away. I grabbed my phone, called 911, and waited. When the cops arrived, they found nothing. No one in the house. But the smell of urine in the crawl space was real. And even more disturbing, there was a puddle of it on the floor, as if someone had been hiding there for days. I don't know who it was, but I'm certain it wasn't anyone I knew. The thought of a stranger in my house, watching us, waiting. It's something I'll never forget. From that night on, I never forget to lock my door.